World War II, often called the worst war in history, began in 1939 and lasted until 1945. It destroyed more and cost more than any other war. Although the exact number of people killed, wounded, or missing will never be known, more than 70 million people around the world donned military uniforms, and it is estimated that as many as 35 million civilians and uniformed soldiers died. The United States alone accounted for more than 800,000 casualties. The war also caused more changes than any previous wars. It launched the atomic age and dramatically changed the weapons of war. There are many reasons why nations go to war, but for the Americans in uniform fighting in faraway places that they knew little about, their task was clear. They were fighting to win. They were fighting to end the evil of tyranny, the greed of empire building, the abusiveness of self-serving dictators, and most importantly, they were fighting to preserve freedom and democracy. Second Lieutenant James Perkins, now 96 years old, was one of those Americans who fought in World War II, and this video is about his contributions to the Allied victory in Europe while he served as bombardier in the United States Army Air Force.
I was, of course, just out of high school. I went to Parker High School in the south side of Chicago, and then came out, and I did sign up to start college nearby, but by that time the draft was very active, and I actually signed up a little before that because we all knew where we were going, and so I signed up. And if you signed up, you could select your service.
In his memoirs, Jim wrote extensively about his experiences in the Air Force, beginning with his first day as a new recruit.
It all began in July 1943 at the old Polk Street station in Chicago, where Mom and Dad and a few friends gathered to see me off on a train headed towards Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Missouri, where I would begin basic training in the Army Air Force. I had never been away from home for long before, and all the tensions of wartime concentrated in my anxious mind as the huggings and wavings ended and I clambered aboard in a crowd of other nervous young men, probably sharing similar feelings, each of us clutching a few allowed possessions. Arriving at the railhead at Jefferson Barracks, where incidentally my father had received basic training in World War I, we disembarked into a sea of GIs who began to razz this motley collection of undisciplined greenhorns in odd apparel who dared to appear among khaki veterans. Most of them probably had arrived only weeks before we did, but the uniform placed the recent draftee and the grizzled veteran on equal ground to insult a civilian. Here the world would begin to turn upside down, where the trappings of civilian life scaled off and the wartime military existence began. The hike to our camp area about a mile away was a psychological disaster, and if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I would have just as soon gone by truck. Straggling and forlorn, we hoped in our misery that our destination was just around the next bend. It was not, and GIs massed from their huts to razz us. "You'll be sorry," was the favorite taunt. They were wrong. We were sorry already. The sorriest bunch you ever saw. A skunk at a garden party would feel hardly more unwelcome than a bunch of guys wearing civvies in the midst of an army camp. Of course, much of this kidding was done in good humor. These guys knew as we were then, so they used to be, and as they were now, so we would become.
One of the difficulties in preparing airmen was the limited number of slots available for formal flight training. They had to wait their turn for more training at the San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center, better known as SAC. While at SAC, Jim wrote a letter to his parents describing a brief but memorable encounter with General George C. Marshall.
Stopping directly in front of me to watch my partner fire was General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, 5 stars shining in the Texas sun. I could have touched him and was free to watch him since I was at ease. I was deeply impressed by the character and competence projected by Marshall, and knew instantly that Hitler's crew of arrogant Prussian generals could not match him. It was obvious why Roosevelt said he could not sleep nights if Marshall was gone from Washington, which is why he was not selected to lead the Allied invasion forces from England. As we know, Eisenhower was recommended by Marshall and accepted for that position. I sent a fervent letter home to my parents assuring them that our Allied armies would be victorious, for I had seen the top commander, boss of Eisenhower and MacArthur, who met regularly with the Commander-in-Chief, Franklin D. Roosevelt. From San Antonio, we were assigned to Hatbox Field in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where one of the great disappointments of my life occurred. We flew primary trainers from this field, and after many takeoffs and landings, they concluded that my depth perception was off, and that I should become a navigator or bombardier. A kind officer, whom I shall always remember, assured me that I would remain in the cadets and was most explicitly officer material. Perhaps they saved my life, for once or twice I did land 10 feet above the ground, and 6 feet under might have been next. It was a difficult time in my life, but I was ready for the next experience. It was not long in coming.
And ended up various places in training as a bombardier navigator, and which if you went in the 2-engine bombers, the B-25 and B-26, they only have one. You were the bombardier and the navigator. And on the 4-engine bomber, where I ended up, you had both bombardier, because we were trained in celestial navigation, that is over the ocean. We could navigate around the continent anywhere. But when you got out to using the stars and the moon and the sun to navigate, and that was another training. So we had 2 on one was the navigator and the bombardier, where I ended up.
One night, by mistake, we bombed a lighted oil derrick, which, from several thousand feet, resembled a target. Practice bombs had 10-pound powder charges, which could both damage and scare. We said nothing, prayed for bad aim, and heard nothing. So, evidently, the event has passed into history unnoticed. Either that, or some former oil worker is telling his grandkids about the awful fright and the crazy Air Force. A training mission at Big Spring brought me as close as I ever came to parachuting. Incredibly, at 10,000 feet, we lost both engines and dropped into a steep glide. We clustered around the pilot, advising as much as we dared about restarting them. 8,000, 6,000, 5,000. We watched the altimeter. Lots of sputtering and coughing, no starting. Then the pilot gave the order. Prepare to bail out. We leave at 2,000 feet. Clear the way because I'm coming too. 2 of us were all elbows at the door with no qualms about jumping when we heard the most beautiful sound in the world as both engines started at 3,000 feet. This was over a remote part of the West Texas desert, so a search would have taken a while. Spending a night bivouacking in the desert under a magnificent sky was a thrilling experience, which led one to wonder why you were defacing the desert to prepare for demolishing somebody's town. But then, in that war, with the insane aggressions of Hitler and the cruelties of the Japanese, you didn't consider that anything but force would stop them. So, violence it would be, and the Strategic Air Force had already inflicted serious damage, and more was coming. At Westover, arriving airmen were formed into crews consisting of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio man, engineer, nose gunner and waist gunner, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. Our pilot was 3 years my senior, a big man who played football with the University of Pennsylvania. Jovial, gentle, but no nonsense about flying. We soon became acquainted with the B-24, which was little more than a flying bomb bay with guns. It was often called a flying coffin, not only because of its appearance, but also its alleged instability. It was not pressurized, had no heat or other comforts, and was drafty. 40 below outside meant 40 below inside, and that was not uncommon at 20,000 feet in a New England winter. One entered through the bomb bay, crawled through a tunnel to the bombardier's compartment in the nose. Best seat in the house for a scenic view, ahead of which was the nose turret gunner's position. Above on the flight deck were the pilots, engineer, and radio man. We were not to reveal the date or time of our departure to North Africa to anyone, since all movements, especially to overseas, were secret. Earlier, I gave my parents a phrase which, when stated by phone, meant I was leaving. When that day finally arrived, I called them and said, "It's a beautiful day," and that was it. Lifting off from Mitchell, we pointed toward Dow Field, Bangor, Maine. Last stop in the United States, and a relatively short hop.
Sure. I had 11 missions. But every time you went out, you'd lose some plane, more than one. We always came home and we had holes in us and gashes in the wing, but that's just anti-aircraft.
It was my job to check bomb installation, condition of release equipment, availability of flak suits and first aid equipment, and when aloft to keep aware of course, headings, locations, and other navigational data, as well as to make observations about enemy actions or reactions, such as rail or highway traffic, flak and fighter response, or anything which might be useful to intelligence officers. Upon return, we would be debriefed about all of the above, plus, of course, and especially, target conditions and bomb hits. My first mission was to Graz of Bruck, in Austria, where railroad marshalling yards were targeted. From the initial point to the release point, where no evasive action could be taken, we picked up moderate flak, the little black flowers that bloom in the sky. Encountered no fighters, and we did hit the target. Afterward, I was exhilarated by my reaction or lack thereof to real live flak, which I had witnessed from the best seat in the house. The big black bursts were from the German 88, considered the best weapon on either side in the war. The gray bursts were from a lesser caliber gun. We felt some concussion and did get hit by some jagged pieces of metal which tore holes in the ship. The one that gets you, you'll never see, they used to say. And I had seen a lot of them, but never saw the one I didn't see. Now I was a veteran. My second mission was of another color. When the briefing room doors were shut and the cover pulled back from the target map, the veterans gasped. The rookies feigned calmness, and the briefing officer confirmed it. We were going to Vienna, one of the most heavily defended areas, to hit the Kagran oil refineries outside the big city. Oil was the #1 strategic target at the time, and although Kagran was not producing much, the Air Force did not want them producing any. It was to be a massive strike with the whole wing going. The briefing predicted heavy flak, probable fighter opposition, and good weather, with squadrons to go over at 20,000 feet with 500-pound bombs. It was to be a long haul, and we would be on oxygen for most of it. Taking off with our lethal load, we climbed on course over the Adriatic Sea on a heading toward Yugoslavia and Austria. Over enemy territory, we doglegged some to avoid flak zones, but picked up some fire anyhow, and got a few nasty scars from distant fighters, which turned out to be our P-51 Mustangs and not their Me-109s. One of our waist gunners had the sharpest eye and highest skill for aircraft identification. Fighters were reported at 3 o'clock high. We all looked anxiously, but stayed off the intercom waiting for his report. They are... Just a minute. They appear to be... Can't quite see. Yes, they're P-51s, P-51s. The plane sagged in relief. After several hours of cold, oxygen, occasional flak and fighter scares, we approached the IP, or initial point, usually distant 10 to 15 miles from the target, from which place the correct course to bring you over the target would be determined by the bombardier, and along which no evasive action could be taken. The enemy knew you were sitting ducks along that path and planned their anti-aircraft fire accordingly. Making a sharp turn at the IP, we opened the bomb bay doors as if revealing our destructive burden for all to see. Gunners left their turrets, since fighters, theirs or ours, didn't want to get into the flak either. We suspected all hell would break loose soon, and were not disappointed. Our brothers in squadrons ahead were already taking a beating from a heavy concentration of fire which darkened the sky with its intensity.
I always thought when I was on a mission and even coming home, I always used to think, boy, if my mother could ever see me doing this. You have to have a means of guarding, of protecting ourselves. And the military provides us with that. It also provides excellent discipline and a place where you can learn, a place where you can also gain advantage when you're discharged in getting, if you have interest, further education, jobs. So I always had pretty good feeling about the military. I'm glad that I had that chance to be opposition to the dictatorships and the criminal that existed, and we could fight for democracy and freedom. And so I would say I was glad that I could do it. And I'll go again if you want to.